And welcome to our live show here for the second straight week. We're going to bring you the East Regional Rankings from the NCAA Division III, the home office in Indianapolis, Indiana. Frank Rossi with James Baker. And James, again, maybe a little bit of a surprise that we spotted in these rankings this week, but nothing tremendously overpowering compared to last week where we had a couple mistakes and omissions, etc. But why don't you run down for folks joining us one more time what this all means and where we're going with these as the last week of the regular season is upon us.
All right, so Division III football, the biggest division with the smallest schools. There's about almost 250 of them out there. Only 32 make the playoffs. Imagine that, FBS, if you could have more than 4 teams. Well, with Division III, we get 32. 25 of those get in through an automatic qualifier. Think of the March Madness type of a thing. So you win your conference, you're in the tournament. There are 2 Pool B or teams that are basically unaffiliated with a league or parts of leagues that have yet to be granted an automatic qualifier. One of the teams from our region is a candidate for that. And then finally, there are 5 other at-large bids, sometimes referred to as Pool C. So you get 25 plus 2 is 27, plus 5 is 32, and that's how it adds up into the 32-team field. Now, typically, how it's structured and what we've learned over the years in talking with the various chairs of the NCAA Division III Championship Selection Committee is that they look for the top 8 teams in the country. They pick 4 number 1 seeds, and then they try to match those along with 4 number 2 seeds. There are certain travel restrictions. They really try to avoid flights if at all possible. There's a 500-mile rule, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. But basically what we're going to be looking at is for the East region, of which I believe, Frank, there are we have 8 conferences that are eligible for 7 conferences that are eligible for automatic qualifier bids, and there is 1 conference needing the NUMAC that could be eligible for Pool B. So there will be 8 teams from the region, and this ranking is trying to sort those out as far as who is where and how that could look on a national scale. And so simple as mud, right? Clear as mud.
Let's go to these rankings at this point, and James, like we said, that some people will be unsurprised at our first few, at least, here coming up here.
Yeah.
And so let's start off. No change. Delaware Valley 9-0 with a 5.06 strength of schedule. That win versus Wesley is still looming very huge. Number 2 remains Brockport. We had information sent to us from Joe Germanario Sr. last night that his son will not be quarterbacking against St. Lawrence. We didn't think he would be based on the extent of the injury on Saturday. He was, quote, knocked out cold, his father said, and kind of everything we knew, but we're afraid to hear. But they're hoping to get him back in time for playoffs. They need to go 10-0 to protect a home game in at least the second round, if not the first round of the playoffs. So important that they win versus St. Lawrence. With that defense they have, they very well could. Number 3. Springfield. This was one we were a little nervous about. We were thinking that perhaps Wesley could jump them. It did not happen. Even though there's a slight drop in strength of schedule, the win versus Western New England becomes a regional ranked opponent, and as such, they have a slightly better resume with that attached to it at the end of the day. And notice something else, James. What is the number at the end of each one of these teams' win-loss records? 0. So there's going to be a little bit of a, let's say, association by win-loss record going on here as we come down this list. Anything jumping out at you so far?
Well, I mean, I know some national pundits would maybe make an argument that they would view Wesley as a stronger team than Springfield, and maybe that'll be proven head-to-head in the tournament. We'll see how things shake out there. But at the end of the day, it does seem like these regional advisory committees or RACs are placing a lot of important factor to a certain extent, strength of schedule and wins against regionally ranked opponents notwithstanding.
Say that one more time for folks about the ordering, because we had a little bit of a dropout in our stream there. I just want to make sure people hear it in its entirety in case it cut out. So you're saying basically that you looked across the 4 different regions and only 2 times did you see an out-of-order win-loss record in terms of number of losses, let's say 1 loss over 0 losses or 2 losses over 1 loss?
That's right. That's right. In the East region, it basically falls, the win-loss record is the order by which it's ranked, and that'll come up. We'll talk about that a little more with one of the teams that we weren't really sure where they would come into play based on strength of schedule. But in the South region, you basically the North region, same thing. Everything sort of follows that methodology. In the South, there's an exception with Hardin-Simmons being ranked number 2 at 7-1 over several 9-0 teams. Hardin-Simmons' only loss on the season is to the defending national champions, and they played them pretty well. So I think that sort of quality loss is being looked at favorably. Interesting, though, Wesley did not get the same same look as they did. So as they appear here at 8-1, they lost a very close game to Del Val, who is in the running to be a number 1 overall seed, like I talked about earlier. If there's in the past, if there's been a 10-0 Eastern region sort of champion, you can say, they typically end up in a top-seeded situation. We'll see how that pans out. The only other exception, Frank, was I believe in the West region. Wisconsin lacrosse at 7-2 was ranked ahead of 2 teams that were 8-1. Their only losses are to Whitewater and to Oshkosh, who is the national runner-up. So once again, I think it's a lot of precedence being placed on who you lost to, and that sometimes buoys teams.
Well, you brought up Wesley. We've put it on the screen already at 526 strength of schedule, but the win versus Frostburg State, and they only lost versus Delaware Valley, number 1 nationally. Though, like you're suggesting, they could have the Hardin-Simmons type argument here of why weren't we up higher if we lost the number 1 seed or a number 1 ranked team in our region. Different racks determine these. There are different groups of 8 people for each one of these rankings. So it's not, let's say, the same 8 doing East, North, South, and West, and you will see differences based on those. The National Committee has the ability on Saturday night to send back rankings if they feel that something is being done inconsistently or out of order, and ask the committee the RAC to rework something or to re-review it ultimately. And so they may smooth out any of these anomalies that you could see across regions ultimately. We'll see what happens with that, though. Next up, Frostburg State. So 1 through 5 have not changed from last week. They are a 474 strength of schedule, which is slightly improved. It'll get closer to 500 when they play Salisbury on Saturday. 8-1, their only loss versus Wesley. This is the other interesting thing. There are 2 match pairs, actually 3 match pairs of a team followed by the team that lost to them that will be going on in this list. And the only exception to that is Wesley and Del Val. Del Val and Wesley could easily be 1-2, as you're suggesting, like Hardin-Simmons and Mary Hardin-Baylor, and Wesley and Frostburg are. But I guess that would also force Frostburg to be pulled up as well, because they took Wesley to overtime. So there's the trouble in trying to raise Wesley is you almost have to take Frostburg with them, and if you do so, how do you justify doing that to both Brockport and Springfield ultimately, or just Springfield? So that's the conundrum that the committee probably faces here.
Yeah, and one thing else on Frostburg, for going back to the March Madness reference, Frank, they are on the bubble, and if they can beat Salisbury in Week 11, which is not a slam dunk because the Seagulls gave the Wolverines losing 30-20, Frostburg would theoretically be the first team up in the East for one of those Pool C bids I mentioned. Their position at 5 is advantageous in that respect, and a lot of projections, I think, have them getting in at 9-1 if they can beat Salisbury. Once again, not a slam dunk there.
Let's go to number 6. Husson remains at number 6 at 496 strength of schedule, but they lose their regionally ranked opponent win versus Union, as Union no longer ranked. Western New England, however, was their loss, and you can tell now that Western New England has appeared twice in this list as a win and a loss regionally, that they're going to probably appear somewhere in this list, but we're not there yet. Number 7, Plymouth State. They go from number 10, was it last week, up to number 7 at 9-1, but that's the good news for them. The bad news, Frostburg State, unfortunately, is 2 spots above them. That will be either the first or the second team eligible for Pool C coming up on Saturday night, unless something changes, because the order of events here would be first Pool B determined. Hardin-Simmons or Springfield will get the second slot most likely. And then after that, you've got a situation where if Springfield doesn't go in Pool B, they'll be the first team probably picked or second team probably picked out of the 5 Pool C teams.
Yeah.
And then Frostburg's going to sit there as a team that's going to have to bite their fingernails. That means if they're biting their fingernails, Plymouth State may never get to the table.
I think you mean Framingham State, because Plymouth State's in by the Pool A.
Framingham State may never get to the table. Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah.
Framingham State never gets to the table. Good save there.
That's
Thank
right.
you. This was the one that I was actually trying to point out. We make these so interchangeable sometimes, these two teams, and yet it's kind of funny. Framingham State may never get to the table. Plymouth State, you're fine. Don't worry about it. we did a whole many hours of the show on Saturday, and we still can't get the teams right, or at least I can't. But go ahead. You get my point. Framingham State may never see the light of day on the Pool C table.
Yeah, the chances of that are pretty slim with only 5 bids going across, 3 other regions, including this one. So, but one thing to keep in mind for those, out there new to this process, if you look at these rankings, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of those teams have a very good chance of hosting a first-round game. It's not necessarily always a slam dunk for a 4 to, and this is assuming that where Wesley gets put into a bracket where they are ultimately the 4 seed. They could end up in a bracket and be the 3 seed. Either way, this upper quadrant or 4 teams, you can say, are in pretty good shape to host at least one first-round game. The 1s and 2s, if they win and advance, can typically host twice and potentially 3 times, depending on how things shake out. But anything below that, like if you're a Husson or you're a Plymouth State, you're almost guaranteed to be going on the road somewhere within a 500-mile radius. We've typically paired Springfield and Husson just because of the distance from Bangor, Maine to most other places. It would be a doable drive. Plymouth State, you're probably looking at heading south towards Pennsylvania, maybe Maryland or Delaware, depending on how things shake out.
Or even Brockport, I think, is reachable for them to a certain extent as well. Number 9, RPI, who really controls their own destiny in the Liberty League. So this is kind of irrelevant to them. Either they're going to be in the playoffs via the Liberty League bid, or they're going to lose another game and not be in the rankings at all. That's simple as that.
Yeah.
Very good strength of schedule, though, at 546, in a win versus number 10, Western New England.
Yeah. And here, once again, we see the exact same conundrum, whereas, looking up at number 6, Husson at 7-1, they've lost to Western New England, who lost to RPI. Each team has 2 losses, but Husson has 1, so Husson ends up into the 6th position, whereas RPI and Western New England are 9 and 10. They could also have an argument like, hey, we should be ranked higher. But as we've seen kind of across the board, the win-loss with the combination of other factors does seem to create the pecking order, I guess you could say, of how things pan out. But we did talk about in the our East Region predictions the first time around, you couldn't have RPI without Western New England and vice versa. Here they are, and it'll be interesting to see how they pair up.
Okay, James, and we have our timely error one more time showing up here today. So we're going to try to wrap things up here, and as such, if you give me a moment here, we will get the rest of the teams up there. Albright, Salisbury, SUNY Maritime were notable teams missing from the list. We brought those up in our main show. So as such, let's kind of close things out here as we still are able to, and just look at where we're going from here. We got some good games on Saturday. Wesley and Del Val, Wesley and Del Val. They played in week 1, but Del Val and Widener is where I'm going after, which could really affect things. You've got Brockport and St. Lawrence without Joe Germanario for Brockport. That could affect a home game scenario. You've got Springfield versus MIT. If Springfield loses that game, MIT was not going to the playoffs, and probably not Springfield either at that point. You have Wesley and who is Wesley playing on this week? I've lost track of this.
I have also. I want to say it's a team that they'll be favored over fairly, I think fairly reasonably. But let's just go to the videotape here real quick. Wesley is going to be playing in their season finale. Christopher Newport, who
CNU, which
has struggled
had a
little
tough
bit.
season. Yeah, they definitely have.
Yeah.
We have Frostburg against Salisbury. That could be a Salisbury win and probably propel Salisbury into the regional rankings, although probably not on the table because I don't know if they would be able to surpass Framingham State. So if you're a Framingham State fan, you really have to root for Salisbury to beat Frostburg, but not by much. You don't want them to win by 40 or something like that. But Husson, you're locked in. Plymouth State, you're locked in. RPI, we know the story with you. West New England, you're locked in. So it's going to start to become a question of how this Springfield, Frostburg, and Framingham State, and Salisbury situation all interplay. Those are your Pool C eligible teams. And beyond that, we can't really name any teams that are going to be influencing the discussion on Saturday insofar as teams that will be up for possible discussion at all. So that's kind of where we're at here. And, as we close out, we're going to tell you to look forward to an interview with Jake Murphy from Merchant Marine later on tonight. We'll be posting around 6 o'clock this evening the discussion we had with him about the Secretary's Cup game, which will be broadcast on ESPN3 this weekend against Coast Guard. Merchant Marine Coast Guard game is a big one since 1981, I think they've been playing the Secretary's Cup game. And you'll want to stay tuned for that interview. James, any final thoughts?
No, just I think we'll have lightning predictions later this week, and then keep your eyes peeled on Sunday after the brackets are released. We will be interviewing Darla Kirby, who is the chair of the selection committee this season, and so for the 10th season in a row, we were lucky to have the chairperson join us and talk a little bit about how they went through their process of picking out the brackets. I think we've learned enough over the years to be pretty knowledgeable, Frank, and I think we kind of know what to expect. But there's always something that happens. Somebody gets left out that's sort of a surprise, and or maybe not. We'll see. It depends on every year, and it will be nice to talk with Darla and get her input on what it was like to put the field together and go from there.
You froze up on me again, my friend, and that usually means it's time for us to leave. I think that's the hint we get from vMix, our software, that we were going on too long. But nonetheless, folks, we will talk to you throughout the week, and obviously this weekend we will have Darla Kirby joining us here on In the Huddle. Until then, thanks for joining us.